Turkey's intelligence chief, Ibrahim Kalin, met with Hamas leaders to discuss how to deliver aid to Gaza as the war that Hamas started on October the 7th continues to rage. And the talks were held as reports say Turkey's President Erdogan has set his sights on Israel. What could this potentially mean for our nation's closest ally? Here to discuss this and more, Dr. Michael Rubin, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and Director of Policy Analysis at the Middle East Forum. Dr. Rubin, welcome back to Washington Watch. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's always great to be here.
So first, unpack for us why President Erdogan, his tenure in office has been so troubling on multiple fronts.
Well, look, President Erdogan is already past the 2-decade mark in his leadership of Turkey. When he came into office, people thought maybe he'd be a pragmatist, that he could combine Islamic democracy. Look, if you have to put an adjective before democracy, it's not a democracy. That was a mistake of the George W. Bush administration, in which I played a minor role. At any rate, as he's consolidated power, his true ideology has come through. He's a Muslim Brotherhood acolyte through and through, and in that regard, he really wants nothing more than the defeat of the United States, the defeat of Europe, and the eradication of Israel.
There are some that say that he would like to reestablish the Ottoman Empire. He's certainly reaching around the world and certainly in that region to reestablish his influence and the influence of Turkey.
You're absolutely right. Look, some may say he wants to reestablish the Ottoman Empire because his own people, his own aides do. When you look at the maps in the Turkish Defense Ministry, for example, they include much of the former Ottoman Empire. The problem he has had so far is that the remembrance of the Ottoman Empire is much fonder inside Turkey than among its subject peoples in the Arab world and broader. And so you're starting to get a reaction in Greece, in Cyprus, in the Balkans, even in places like Syria, which are now a de facto Turkish proxy, of people pushing back on Turkey trying to almost establish a colonial presence. But, you know, this is what we're up against, and you can't beat back this threat if we refuse to acknowledge it.
What do you say in terms of his comments to suggest that he's eyeing Jerusalem? When you look at him and those around him making these comments about Israel?
Look, I'm not as worried about Recep Tayyip Erdogan's rhetoric as I am about his action. And the fact of the matter is, his actions are far more disturbing than even his words are. He's just saying what he's doing. But so many of the recent Hamas attacks on Israel, both before and after October 7th, 2023, were actually planned or financed from Istanbul, Turkey, from the former seat of the Ottoman Caliphate. And so that is something that has really raised the concern in counterterrorism circles, not only in the United States and in Israel, but throughout much of the Arab world as well.
Well, Dr. Rubin, speaking of that, I mean, they had the meeting I mentioned with Hamas this past weekend. Last time I was in Israel just a couple of months ago, speaking with officials that Turkey is smuggling weapons, advanced weapons, into Judea and Samaria to be utilized there by Palestinian activists. How can we, on one hand, be in relationship with Turkey through NATO, and then them actually targeting and undermining our closest ally?
Let me unpack that a little bit, because there's a lot of issues you just touched upon. When it comes to Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, the reason why so much is in play right now is Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, is 89 years old, and he's in his 20th year of his 4-year presidential term. So everyone is jockeying for control after he passes away, and Turkey, first and foremost among them, supporting Hamas and other factions in the West Bank that would mirror what exists in the Gaza Strip.
So let me stop you right there. So is this another Syria type undertaking by Turkey that as they were helping undermine Assad, are they going to move in a vacuum once we see the death of the Palestinian leader?
That's an astute observation. I think it's correct. The difference is the world, or at least Israel, is much more aware now, even if they had let their guard down on October 7th, 2023. They're not foolish about Turkey, and this goes to your previous question. How can Turkey be a NATO ally and act like this? And the problem we have in Washington, across administrations, is too often we want to calibrate our policy towards the way things used to be, or towards the wishful thinking of what we wish they would be, rather than calibrate our policies towards reality. You know, Tony, the statistic I always give to let people know how much Turkey has changed actually comes from Turkey's own interior ministry. And that is, since Recep Tayyip Erdogan came to power in Turkey, the murder rate of women inside Turkey has increased 1,400%. And that's because of the sense of impunity that religious conservatives have now as they conduct honor crimes and so forth inside Turkey.
That brings me to my next point that I was going to ask you, the next question I was going to ask. When we look at that thinking, we want to reestablish what used to be, there's a different ideology driving Turkey when, we thought they were moving toward a more secular democracy, and they were for a time, but they're now, I think, digging deep into those ideological roots of Islam. And for some reason, the West has a hard time understanding what is unfolding before our very eyes.
Well, I think there's also a psychological component here on the part of Turkey's leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, which in my view is somewhat similar to what we see inside Iran with Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. And that is, when you have dedicated your whole life to this noxious form of Islamism, and you want to see nothing more than the destruction of Israel, and you realize that your own mortality is looming, then you want to put your plans into action now. You realize you don't have time to wait. And so what I see in both Iran and in Turkey is a sense of impatience, which is making the situation far more dangerous.
Okay, so let me circle back around to what I asked before. NATO. Turkey is a part of NATO. We're a part of NATO. I mean, that's a close relationship. We come to one another's aid. Israel's our closest ally. It is clear, it's not a secret, that Turkey is undermining the security and the well-being of Israel.
Okay, here's the problem. NATO, which Turkey joined in 1952, is governed by consensus. So Turkey can be the Trojan horse inside NATO. Why don't we just kick Turkey out? Because there's no mechanism inside NATO in order to kick someone out. In the past, France has removed itself, Greece has removed itself, but in those cases, it was voluntary. What I believe is happening right now is Turkey sees that it can do more for our enemies and for its own noxious ideology by remaining inside NATO to do two things. One is to block consensus and therefore basically paralyze the organization. The second actually is even scarier, and that has to do with its nuclear program. Turkey is opening a Russian-built nuclear reactor this year. Now, when you had Iraq try to build a nuclear reactor in 1981, Israel took that out, and thank God they did. In 2007, Israel eliminated Syria's North Korean-built plutonium processing plant. But now we have Turkey doing basically what Iran has done. But the difference is with Turkey is that they can hide behind NATO's Article 5. They can hide behind the sense that if they are attacked, all NATO members have to respond and as if they themselves were attacked. And so what I'm afraid is happening is Turkey is using its NATO membership in order to develop a nuclear weapon. And it's going to remain in NATO until it becomes its own nuclear power. And then all bets are off because, again, Erdogan is acting on almost apocalyptic ideology. He's no longer grounded in reality.
Dr. Rubin, what you've just laid out there, when Israel, their intelligence generally speaking. Obviously, there were some failures on October the 7th, but as it pertains to Iran, they've been tracking every move. They've been able to keep their nuclear program bottled up by taking it out here and there, instead setting them back 5 years, 10 years. Of course, now we're at this critical point once again. But what you've laid out there is Turkey pursuing the same thing, but they can't be touched by Israel because Israel could then suffer the wrath of all of the allied NATO countries. Do you think that would happen if Israel acted to protect themselves against Turkey and their nuclear plan? Do you think it would trigger a NATO reaction?
Well, here are the two, if you will, points that could actually undermine Turkey's gamble. Number one, Article 5 only comes into play within NATO if you know who actually took the action. So if Israel doesn't leak like the United States does, and you have an assassination here or an assassination there of a Turkish nuclear scientist, then Turkey may not be able to gather enough consensus within NATO in order to enact Article 5. And when you actually read the legal document, the legal article, Article 5, you also have to get NATO agreeing that there has been a threat that is an attack. And so it gives NATO, sort of other members like the United States, like Germany, like France, a way out to say, you know what, we don't actually think that this qualifies for Article 5. So Turkey's taking a gamble that we are going to come to their assistance. I think we should make clear to Turkey that we are not going to do that in advance.
All right, Dr. Rubin, we got about 3 minutes left. I want two questions I want to ask to wrap up. Number one, by Turkey remaining in NATO, is that not devaluing NATO for the purposes of the U.S.?
I think it is. And you know what a lot of Turks say, and a lot of Turkey's cheerleaders say, is, hey, look, Turkey has the second largest army within NATO after the United States. Therefore, it's too valuable to kick out. But that's the wrong metric. When you have a conflict with NATO, you have a meeting in Brussels, and each country decides how much they're going to contribute. What matters is how much each country is going to contribute, not how big their army is on paper. If Turkey only decides to contribute 37 people, it's not an important country, so we've got to stop using this false metric and recognize Turkey is not an asset to NATO. It's a liability.
All right, I'm going to go back to your theory of them using NATO to allow them to advance their nuclear plan or program and to do other things to put themselves in a position of strength. Might that also be, when you look at where Turkey's located geographically, they're surrounded by basically Islamic nations. There has been a lot of outreach. Are they building their own kind of coalition of Islamic nations?
Right now, Turkey is, but it's less of a coalition than almost like a Chinese style, we are on top and you are our proxies, that you listen to us. So when you look at what Turkey is doing, for example, in Libya or in Somalia or in Syria, they're not approaching these states as equals. They're approaching these states as their proxies, and they expect, in true Muslim Brotherhood fashion, that Turkey speaks and these other countries will listen. But again, we are woefully blind if we don't recognize and counter what Turkey is now doing.
Dr. Michael Rubin, fascinating conversation. I want to thank you for taking time to join us today and unpack this. This is something I've been watching, will continue to watch, and look forward to having future conversations with you about what is happening in the Middle East, in particular with Turkey.
Thank you so much.